Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UNESCO webinar series. These events are co-convened by UNESCO Roots of Enslaved Peoples Project and the Global Humanity for Peace Institute at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. My name is Chateau Gill. I'm the director of the Institute. Now, to today's program. This is the sixth webinar. We have chosen a theme that is absolutely, utterly relevant to the communities around the world today. In such troubled time, there's a greater need for trust, truth, repair, and restoration. To help us explore these critical topics of our time are Dr. Gail Christopher, an inspirational speaker and the driving force behind truth, racial healing, and transformation effort in the US, and our dear friend to many of us, Rob Corcoran, who is renowned for designing and co-creating the racial healing initiative, Hope in the Cities. So, Dr. Christopher, Rob, I now turn the program over to you.
It is my honor to be with all of you today and to bring, hopefully, hope and inspiration and the confidence that we are better than the conditions that beset us. I'm going to talk about the truth, racial healing, and transformation effort going on in this country, and some of the opportunities that are being presented to us. So as we're doing this work across America to determine if, in fact, there is an appetite for healing, we decided as the organization that I lead, the National Collaborative for Health Equity, we decided to enter into the polling business, if you will, to get some data about what is the pulse of America right now around healing and facing our past. There's been a lot of work going on for a very long time, but certainly over the last 7 to 10 years. And we were pleasantly surprised that 31% of the respondents in this nationally representative poll, they believe that relational work is critically important for us to develop the capacity to see ourselves through the lens of a shared humanity. Now, that's almost a third. So that would indicate that there is a readiness in this country for doing the relational work that I'm going to talk about, and my dear colleague and friend Rob Corcoran's going to talk about that even more specifically. We also found that 8 out of 10 respondents, they support the idea of diversity, of different people coming together in the workplace so that we can get to know each other and get beyond our differences. And most importantly, in this era of book banning in this democracy, 8 out of 10 also believe that teaching about our history of racism is an important part, a critical first step to us evolving and developing as a society. And then finally, contrary to what the media would tell us, even in the face of the divisions and the polarization in our society, 88% of the respondents actually want a leader that will unite rather than divide us as a country. We're going to do this survey annually, and we are working with a reputable polling firm that has done polling for presidential candidates. And so we feel pretty confident that we need to tap into this reservoir of information. And we're calling this our annual Heart of America survey. So we know that the movement for truth, racial healing, and transformation has really gained some momentum across the country. We know that there are over 300 public health jurisdictions that have declared racism to be a public health crisis in this country. There are many local jurisdictions, over 15, that have been funded by philanthropy to bring coalitions together to focus on truth, racial healing, and transformation. We also know that over 70 college campuses have implemented Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation campus centers. We have leadership from our congressional leaders that have put forth resolutions to create a national effort, a national commission. And collectively over the years, we've gotten 200 or more supporters for those resolutions, although we haven't quite gotten them passed. You know, our political process requires almost a supermajority, but the momentum is there, the energy is there. So I wanted to bring you that good news, both from our poll and from the movement across America, so that you understand that, you know, we haven't perfected this, but we have taken the step to assert the courage that this work has to be done. And if I'm going to ask you to put the slides down for a moment, I just want to talk with my audience a little bit directly. Thank you so much. One of the critical lessons that I have learned over the years is that language is so important. And that's why I took the time to reframe the word healing, not as a deficit frame, but as a natural imperative for ourselves, our bodies, and for our communities. Often in this, when we talk about the effects of racism and we talk about changing, you know, hearts and minds, we talk about discrimination and we talk about prejudice, but I have come to truly understand in my bones that what has to be changed are our individual and collective beliefs about one another, about our humanity. And so the work is really about changing our beliefs. What are the truths that we think we hold that shape and motivate our actions? Even though the United States has had a civil war and a civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, we keep going forward, and then we encounter a strategic resistance that some people call backlash. But I submit that we have never done the critical work of changing belief systems. When our country spent more than 250 years actualizing the belief in the dehumanization or the less than human reality of people of color, that belief is not only embedded in our consciousness, it's embedded in our structures, it's embedded in our society. And we will not have permanent, sustainable transformation until we actually address those beliefs. And so we need to tap into the knowledge and the wisdom that has emerged in the late 20th and 21st century about how beliefs are shaped and how beliefs are held. And as we look at the tragedies that beset the world today, the unimaginable violence and loss of lives, if you peel that back, you'll see that it's the outpicturing of beliefs that dehumanize one another. Now, we call that hate, but I am submitting that underneath that permission to hate is the entrenched belief that the perceived other is less than human or deserves to be annihilated or destroyed. The rejection of immigrants, the worldwide crisis that we have in refugees and homelessness. So much of this is rooted in our permission that somehow our societies have given us to devalue our fellow human beings, literally our brothers and sisters. And we are that, you know, we are an expansive human family. We all trace our ancestry back to Africa. And so this notion that we can have some sort of false taxonomy of humanity, where those at the top are somehow more valued than others, this is a archaic, nonsensical relic that needs to be eliminated from our individual and collective understanding of who we are as a human family. And so it's the belief systems that have to be addressed. And there are many ways to do it. The Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation concept is truly a strategy to change mindsets, to change beliefs, to change hearts and feelings, and then to mobilize a supermajority to address and dismantle the systems that have structured the consequences of those deeply held beliefs over centuries. Quickly, I will tell a story. I'm reading a wonderful book now. I've read so many books about the life of Abraham Lincoln, but this one is relatively new. It's by Steve Inskeep, and it's called Differ We Must. And it's the story of Abraham Lincoln as a politician. And it takes 16 instances in his life where he dealt with people who disagreed with him, but he kept focused on his purpose and his intention. And I just want to quickly tell a brief story from that book that captures the depth of the belief in the less than human identity of African Americans. You know, it was Black soldiers that literally worked with their white brothers in the army and in the Union Army that actually won the Civil War. But as they realized they had to bring Black men into battle, there was a great resistance to that by some congressmen. And one in particular's name was George Pendleton. And he, in his argument with President Lincoln, was saying, well, if they're in battle together, they might be killed and they might die together. And if they die together, they'll fall into the trenches together. And we can't allow that. Now just sit with the absurdity of that. But this little story reflects the depth of the belief in human value hierarchy. And even though the Civil War was won by the Union, the narrative remained the same in terms of the lack of humanity of these people who had, in fact, for 250 years built this country through their unpaid labor, and then sacrificed their lives to save this union and assure their emancipation and freedom. So we went on living that lie of a less than human status. And so if you take nothing else from my talk today, please understand the power of consciousness, the power of belief, and how anyone who would transform in a sustainable way a society must, in fact, find creative ways to influence and shape belief systems. Every major movement in the history of our country has been accompanied by a major media transformation. Back in the era of abolition of slavery, it was the newspapers. During the civil rights era, it was television. And now we have artificial intelligence, if you want to call it that, and we have social media. So we have this major transformations in our communications vehicles. We have to leverage those vehicles for our purposes. They are being leveraged for negative and destructive purposes very creatively to divide and to sustain our separation. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work, the strategy, has 5 core pillars. I would like to share those with you, and I've been doing that. Narrative change is the first pillar of TRHT. And that's what we're talking about, because narrative or story is how we affect belief systems. And so we can do it at a collective level, at an institutional level, at an individual level. But one of our pathways, one of our on-ramps for healing is bringing people together and sharing stories that reveal our common and shared humanity. But the narrative work is critical. The other body of work, or the other pillar of the framework, is what we call racial healing and relationship building, bringing people together so that we connect with our humanity. You know, at a deep psychological level, we're either extending love or projecting our confusion and our hatred and our fear. And if we truly love ourselves, then we extend that love to others. And so this idea of connecting and affirming our humanity and the humanity of others, this is the heart of the work of racial healing, and I believe the work of a sustainable democracy. And so narrative change racial healing and relationship building. And it's practical too, because you're trying to build up a supermajority that can exercise their right to vote to put in place the policies. The bottom three pillars of the TRHT framework are the answer to the question, if racial hierarchy is a complete and total fallacy, if it is a lie, and science has shown us that it is, we are more 99% the same than we are different, then how has this lie been maintained for so many centuries? And it's through systematic maintenance, through various myriad forms of separation, through a legal system that has been designed to maintain that racial hierarchy, and through an economic system that's been fueled by this false hierarchy of human value. And so those are the 5 pillars of TRHT: narrative change, racial healing and relationship building, and then that bottom tier has to do with the structural embedding. And so if we're going to undo the structures, we have to have specific initiatives that will overcome and transform our separation dynamics. We have to change our laws and policies, and we have to transform our economy. And the good news is that people are doing this across America, and there really is momentum. But the best way to remain whole and healthy when you're doing this structural work is to be part of a community, a collective group of people that you feel you can trust, you can lean on, you can turn to. And that's why we take a holistic approach. We think the TRHT framework is holistic because we know the nature of the work, and we have absolute hope that the work will succeed. We can learn a lot from our ancestors. Some people have asked, how did my life take this course? How did I get so involved in this work? And I'll share with you briefly one story that put me on this path. And it was the unexpected death of my firstborn child. Now, when I lost my firstborn child, I didn't know that there was such a thing as an epidemic of infant mortality among African-American mothers and families. But when you hold the deceased body of your own child in your arms, it changes you. It changed me, and I became determined that no other parent should experience this kind of loss and trauma. And it led me to dedicating my life, first in a clinical way as a practitioner on the South Side of Chicago, and then as someone who designed social programs, and then ultimately policy work, and then philanthropic work, but always pulling that thread of how do we prevent the suffering, the needless suffering, because the deepest cut of the loss of my child was the fact that the surgery that might have in fact saved her life had been invented by an African-American decades before she was born, and that surgery had saved the lives of many white infants, but was not offered to me and my baby, our family, because of, I believe, the racism of our medical system at the time. Now, that was many, many decades ago. I went on to have 2 wonderful children who have lived into adulthood and are living very beautiful lives. My daughter is Heather McGhee, the author of the book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Society and How We Can Prosper Together. My son is a brilliant artist and choreographer. So I have healed from my loss, but I honor her memory, and I give thanks for the opportunity to dedicate my life to hopefully making life easier, making life better for so many more. But as I draw to a close and turn it over to Rob, I just want to remind us that our efforts must be holistic in nature. We must address our individual need for well-being, for affirmation, for belonging, and for consciousness change. And then we can extend that to others, that affirmation, that sense of belonging, that opportunity for development and consciousness change. Because Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And that's the work of racial healing. And that's the transformation that we seek, a society that is rooted in our individual and collective capacity to extend love to one another. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, a brilliant leader, Rob Corcoran.
Thank you, Gail. It's been an honor and a privilege to partner with you over many years, and here today. I don't take that for granted. I am originally from the UK, and I'm always aware of Britain's horrific record of colonialism and transatlantic slavery. So I join this conversation with some humility. As Sherto said, we meet at a time of great pain and loss in so many parts of the world. And so I think the question is, how do we create space for constructive change? How do we cultivate hope and demonstrate positive alternatives, such as the ones that Dr. Christopher was talking about, to break the cycles of repression and revenge and to build healthy and equitable communities, and to move from blame to an acceptance of shared responsibility for a new future? My colleague, Mike Winger, and I have recently written a paper that we called Toward Transformative Reparations. And it draws on experiences in a number of communities around this United States, some of which Dr. Christopher has referred to, as well as Canada and Australia. While we were writing specifically to address urgent needs for relational and policy change in the USA, it may have relevance for other parts of the world. We state that true and enduring change requires both acknowledgement and compensation for past harms, and deep healing from the wounds created by those harms. As Americans, we must heal together as a nation. And this will require a clear and accurate telling of history and a vision for the future to which everyone can contribute and feel a sense of ownership. It will require deep honesty and listening to the stories of others. It will also require a commitment to restorative justice and policies that can effectively foster systemic change. And essentially, it must involve all sectors of our society, including people of different political views. In the United States, transformative reparations must include Indigenous people, in addition to the descendants of enslaved people. And in this regard, we've gained valuable insights from efforts in Canada and Australia. Transformative change calls for courageous and imaginative leadership at all levels. And I'm going to share some practical examples that may give hope. I've worked for most of my adult life with Initiatives of Change, a worldwide movement of people of diverse cultures and backgrounds who are committed to the transformation of society through changes in human motivation and behavior, beginning with their own. I'm speaking from Austin, Texas, where my wife and I moved 4 years ago. But for nearly 40 years, Richmond, Virginia was our home base, where we had the privilege of working with a very diverse network dedicated to racial healing and equity. Few cities carry a heavier burden of racial wounds than Richmond. The first Europeans encountered a flourishing indigenous culture on the banks of the James River where the city of Richmond now stands, and the subsequent interactions of Europeans, the native population, and later Africans were marked by tragedy and cruelty. Imagine a city that was the country's second largest domestic slave market, a city that became the epicenter for a civil war that caused more American deaths than 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam combined. And after 100 years of American apartheid, Virginia's state legislators led the way for massive resistance to school legislation, to school integration. By the time a Black majority was elected to city council in 1977, Richmond was a deeply traumatized community. And very few people, Black or white, wanted to talk about it. I remember we once did a TV program that we called The Polite Silence. So it was a revolutionary and liberating moment in 1993 when residents of all backgrounds of that same city came together with the bold vision that the very place where racism had begun in its worst form might be the place where healing could begin. That was the start of a movement that impacted not just Richmond, but communities around the USA. And in recent years, it has inspired acts of healing and repair in at least a dozen other countries around the world. And I'll say a bit about that in a moment. But let me start with a personal story. I came to this country in 1980 as a young liberal activist from Europe. My dad had been a trade unionist in Scotland, and I found myself reacting to the intensely conservative environment in much of Richmond at that time. Duma, can we have the first slide, please? One of my early friends and mentors was a Black lay preacher. His name was John Coleman. And I remember him saying, "You have to build a bridge of trust that is strong enough to bear the weight of the truth you're trying to deliver." And I came to understand that it was not my job to judge anyone or to try and convert them to my point of view, but that I might actually learn something from some of the people whom I found so difficult. In this country, there's often a prevailing attitude among liberal activists that we are the solution and others are the problem, or at least in need of education. And I came to realize that self-righteousness is one of the biggest obstacles to racial and social change. All of us have our own truths that we want to deliver and a passion for things we want to achieve. But no one has a monopoly on truth. And without trust, it will be impossible to achieve transformative change. So how do we build the bridges that John Coleman talked about? Well, here are some steps that we found to be effective in Richmond. So a first step may simply be to take an honest inventory of our own lives. You know, Howard Thurman, the great civil rights leader and theologian, once wrote, "The root of what I condemn in others is found at long last in the soil of my own backyard. What I seek to eradicate in society, I must first eradicate in my own heart and life. There is no substitute for this." Mahatma Gandhi used to talk about the inner voice. And I've discovered the importance of trying to listen to that voice of truth. My wife and I spend the first hour every day in a time of quiet. One of my friends calls this a time of connection, correction, and direction. Connection with our true self, the inner voice, maybe for some of us, the voice of God or Allah or conscience. Corrections for things I need to do differently. Relationships to mend, apologies to make, direction for the day on how to act, my priorities, and people to reach out to. It's a vital tool for resilience, particularly for those of us who are social activists. For me, I know that trust is a fragile bridge that must be built each day. Honesty about my failures, purity, my motives, unselfishness in my care for others, and love in my readiness to forgive and to accept forgiveness. In my experience, These are some of the building blocks of trust. Well, on the day we moved into our home in Richmond, a Black woman knocked on the door to welcome us to the neighborhood, Audrey and Collie Burton, and you can see them sitting there with us on our front doorstep. We're looking a lot younger there. They lived right across the street. They were civil rights activists. And we quickly became friends and ended up being neighbors for nearly 40 years. The Burtons were intrigued by our international experiences and the idea of connecting personal and social transformation. They also were carrying the scars of racial oppression. They were dissatisfied with the usual approaches to community activism. I remember Collie Burton saying, "You know, we spent so much effort in changing structures, but we had to keep going back and doing it again because we did not change the hearts of people." So they also began to practice daily times of quiet, of inner listening. And in one of those times of reflection, they had the thought to extend a welcome to a senior white city administrator named Howe Todd. Howe Todd and Collie Burton had clashed publicly over the allocation of community block funds. But the Burtons decided to invite Todd and his wife to their home for a cookout. It was the start of a very unusual friendship. They agreed to talk honestly. And some months later, the Black director of a nonprofit organization remarked to me, "Howe Todd used to be known as someone who never listened. Whenever I went into a meeting with him, I always felt that the cards were stacked and that the decisions were already made. Now he really listens to what I have to say." I share this story because the demonstration of transformed lives and relationships proved much more powerful than engaging in exhaustive analysis or simply advocating for others to change. And as more people across the city had the courage to step out of their comfort zones and to examine their attitudes, a network began to grow. An essential step for building trust in any traumatized community is finding ways to acknowledge and heal historical wounds and to create new shared narratives to begin the process of healing. We need truth-telling in ways that bring people together. And we need to understand the power of stories in shaping identity, as Dr. Christopher just said. Because people will not listen to facts or data if they feel their identity is being threatened or their story is not being heard. As we see across the world, pain that is not transformed is transferred, often generationally, and it fuels tribal grievance and anger, as well as shame and guilt. Writing off a whole group to a single story is incomplete and dangerous. The historian John Hope Franklin said, "We need to be able to deal with the ambiguity and complexity of history." Yes, every one of us is touched in different ways by stories of conflict, bitterness, and division. So we must honor the dignity and humanity of every individual while overcoming false narratives and taking ownership of our shared history and the legacies of that history. So in 1993, Richmonders of all backgrounds, grassroots activists, business leaders, elected officials, educators, liberals, and conservatives, and people of different faiths, joined by people from 50 US states and 24 countries, took part in the city's first public walk through history. Walking together to acknowledge sites in our racial history that had previously been too painful or shameful to remember. We found that this kind of walk, done with historical accuracy and without accusation, establishes an agenda for healing. It allows the conscience of a large number of people to be activated in the most positive sense. And over the past decades, thousands of Richmonders have walked this historic trail, the trail of enslaved Africans, as well as many people from communities across the USA and from other regions with histories of racism or ethnic conflict, such as Northern Ireland, the Middle East, South Africa. The universities, the libraries, the museums have come together in a collaborative effort to tell Richmond's story honestly and inclusively. And plans are underway for a national slavery museum at the site of the former slave market. My colleague, the Reverend Sylvester Turner, describes healing and reconciliation as a process of acknowledgement and apology, forgiveness, and accountability and commitment to work together on acts of repair. Next slide, please. So this willingness to openly face the pain together enabled the community to engage in deeply honest conversation. Then this brings me to the third key step. Engaging with others and creating the kind of welcoming space where honest, difficult, and uncomfortable conversations can take place. Honest conversation needs to include all stakeholders, even those whose voices are difficult to hear. We have to ask ourselves, what conversation needs to take place? It's often something that we are avoiding. Who must be part of the dialogue? And how might we invite and welcome them? True dialogue is a journey of discovery, not a destination. We found it was possible to connect racial dialogues with historical narrative, with data, to highlight legacies of our history, the inequalities in areas such as education, housing, public transportation, which are the direct consequence of decades of racially inspired public policies. And we collaborated with a highly respected university professor using census data and narrative to show how racist policies and jurisdictional boundaries have combined to perpetuate concentrated poverty. The program reached hundreds of people, faith-based organizations, advocacy groups, business leaders, elected officials, government employees, educators. And we found that linking data with historical narrative informed participants and moved them emotionally and built energy for action. It connected the head and the heart. This gave a platform for the mayor to launch an anti-poverty commission to develop racial equity strategies. And the city subsequently created the nation's first office of community wealth building. Deeply honest conversation moves us from exchange of information to an experience of transformation in individuals, in relationships, and if sustained, to change in society. I think the only way you get to transformative change is by developing broad multi-sector networks of people who are able to work together in a sustained way. They're able to put aside their egos and call out the best in each other. And sometimes this means reaching out to people or institutions who seem to represent obstacles. The Richmond Times-Dispatch was regarded by many in the city as the public enemy number one because of its racist editorials in support of segregation and attacks on the first majority Black city council. But before Richmond's first history walk in 1993, we sent an interracial delegation to meet with senior editors to share a new vision for Richmond as a potential leader in a national process of racial healing, and to invite their support in communicating that importance of that vision. They were very surprised, as they were used to being criticized. And they assigned Michael Paul Williams, who had recently joined the newspaper as its first Black columnist, to cover the event. It produced front page news. And afterwards, editors and reporters met with community leaders to discuss the role and the responsibility of the newspaper. Editors and reporters took part in history walks and dialogue circles. News coverage and editorials began to change, and we ended up even hosting public forums together. In 2015, the day after the Confederate flag was removed from the state capital of South Carolina, the Times-Dispatch editorial declared that it was finally time for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and that Virginia should take a lead. Another editorial that same year stated, "The case for reparations appears stronger than dismissive critics think. Reconciliation demands truth. Truth requires intellectual courage. A dynamic dominion need not fear examining the status of self-evident truths." And just this past year, Michael Paul Williams was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the removal of Confederate statues from Monument Avenue. A sustained focus on team building and network building is essential. I say this because building teams is the most essential and often the most neglected part of any social change movement. Movements don't fail from the outside, they fail from the inside. Ego, competition, hurt feelings can undermine the most idealistic efforts. So teams and coalitions engaged in efforts to effect radical social change can expect to find amongst themselves the same tensions, prejudices, and fears as the communities they hope to impact. Because we will disappoint and even hurt one another, we must practice the art of forgiveness. Shared leadership keeps us honest. We need people with different gifts, different perspectives, and we must be willing to work with people who challenge our assumptions. This is long-term work. One of the key learnings from the Richmond experience is the power of sustained relationships, shared vision, and commitment. Some of the people in this picture have worked together for more than 20 years. So finally, the experiences and principles I've just outlined now form the basis for the Initiatives of Change International Trust Building Program, involving diverse and local teams in 12 countries. For example, in Kenya, as part of its interfaith trust building work, the team organized an Acknowledging History walk and reflective healing circle at Garissa University, where terrorists massacred 148 students in 2015. In Nigeria, the team is hosting dialogues and workshops that bring together aggrieved communities and members of the police force. In Cameroon, which has been experiencing ethno-political conflict, the focus is on building divides between the Anglophone and the Francophone communities. In Australia, developing relationships and addressing historical wounds between First Nations people and non-Indigenous Australians. In India, closing the cultural gap between rural and urban youth. In Indonesia, countering religious extremism and radicalism by building relationships between Christian and Muslim youth. In South Africa, healing intergenerational traumas caused by fractured family structures as a way to increase trust within communities. In Ukraine, social integration through trust building between internally displaced persons and local communities. And I could go on with stories from Burundi, Nepal, and many other places. This work of transformative healing and repair requires skills of the head and the heart. By identifying and releasing personal baggage, we can create a welcoming environment for others. Through inclusive dialogue, we can hear each other's stories and invite others to share our journey. In acknowledging painful history, we can move towards understanding, shared responsibility, and ultimately forgiveness and reconciliation. And through genuine partnerships and sustained teamwork, we can begin to build trust and to bring about change where it is most difficult and most needed. So I'll close there, and I'm going to pass the word back to Sherta to take us on to the next part of our conversation.
So you both talk about the importance of stories and narratives. Narratives change, stories of change. But in the meantime, you also talk about the importance of listening, inner listening, mutual listening, and so on. So, and in our last webinar, our community participants of intergeneration dialogue also mentioned that all listening is an invitation for something new to come to be, something new that seek to be born. And because it's in such listening, the future will emerge, will unfold. Now, we also know that the communities are complex, and each community has its own fabrics and so on. So how do narratives and stories, first of all, let's talk about just stories. How do narratives and stories help groups work through their grievances, for instance, the anger? When you talk about, if you talk about relation building, and the stories and listening connected to relationship building, but also it's in these kind of through relationship, some of the complex emotions come through, and so that you can have opened up space for honest conversation. Now, for us, the audience, myself and the audience here, which comes first? Does relationship comes first? And is the story itself relationship building? And when do people begin, for instance, people from different sectors of the community come together? When do they voice anger or grievances? And how do these emotions get transformed in the process?
That I'll start, and I know Rob has his own experiences with the answer to this question. What I've learned over the decades, and it's a methodology that we use that we call RX, or Prescription Racial Healing Circle. And it is an intentional design to bring diverse people together with a co-facilitated opportunity to share stories in response to a commonly held prompt designed to address basic human needs for security, self-expression, or agency. So you imagine 25 people that have come together, and they've come together at the invitation of someone they trust or respect. And they've come together in a circle, and they devote several hours. They do it first in diets, and then they share as a larger group. Now, what's happening in this process is this sort of relinquishing, if you will, of a lot of the emotions that create defense and offense. And they're being drawn into one another's stories, but the stories, because they're in response to the same prompt, the stories are revealing the common humanity within and amongst the group. And so this type of story engagement, this type of story sharing for the purposes of healing, ideally precedes the work that is issue focused, or that is designed to work together to tackle structural dynamics. So in that sense, what I'm suggesting is that the weaving of the cloth of the shared humanity, now it might be through having dinners together, as was alluded to and described a bit by Rob, in terms of the social relationships, then led to the capacity to work together. But it's been my experience that we do have to build a sense of connection, a sense of this person is part of my extended human family, before we deal with the grievances and the anger, et cetera. Because if we don't have a sense of some sort of a space of compassion, a space of empathy, a space of trust, then we get the escalation, if you will, of the people use the term discomfort, and that's one way to describe it, but we get the escalation of the negative emotions, which ultimately shuts down the communication, and the communication is essential. So that's one methodology. I do believe that you do want to bring people together and generate this shared fabric of deeper connection and trust, and from that go forward and tackle the agreed upon priorities and issues. And the only other thing I would add to that is that in the TRHT process, there is a collective visioning experience that the coalition engages in, where you actually imagine the success and how the success will show up in your community? You know, what is the new narrative, right? What are the new relationships? When we address the legacy of separation, how do we live together? How do we work together? How do we play together? How are our communities designed? You know, how have our legal structures been transformed? And what is our new economy? So the group has this shared commitment to a broader vision that they have created together.
Thank you. Rob, would you like to add to
Well,
that?
I agree wholeheartedly with what Gail has just said. And I mean, it is true that in the early days of our work in Richmond, for the first several years, the role of hospitality and food, I wrote down food, was so important. You know, at that time, very few white Richmonders had ever been inside a Black home, and very few, or fewer Black folks have been inside white homes. And so the opportunity of actually bringing people together in someone's home to eat together, to share together, proved very powerful. And we ended up having potluck dinners in homes all across the city. And sometimes we'd invite a police chief or a city council member to come and be with the group, simply to share their concerns and needs with. And the group had no agenda at all except to be supportive of this person. It was a very empowering thing. It was done so infrequently. So I'm a great believer in the power of hospitality and welcome. And Gail said something else important, which had to do with people need to be invited by someone who they trust, because very often people will be afraid to go into a certain environment if they haven't been invited by someone who they trust. I remember years back, we were doing we were asked by the Muslim community. This was not long after 9/11. We were invited by the Muslim community in Richmond to help them engage in dialogue with conservative evangelical Christians, right? I didn't know a lot of conservative evangelical Christians, but I had one friend who said, you should talk to this person, this person, this person. And I went from person to person and I said, this so-and-so has recommended that I speak to you. And because they trusted that reference, they came, and that's another whole story. But I think it did take that element of trust of who issues the invitation. Am I going to be really welcomed? Is my story really going to be heard? And creating that kind of environment in what makes that possible. So yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to follow what's emerging here. That is, story matters, hospitality matters, compassion matters. But you're also saying language matters, words matter. Humanizing language, humanizing discourse can really transcend race or color-based antagonism. People are talking about in Latin America and elsewhere, they have similar kind of divisiveness, and therefore this sort of a trust building and bridging the separation is really important. Now, in what you are also saying, words can make worlds. But look at this. At the moment, the deteriorating of trust, the deterioration of mutual trust is prevalent in the area of digital media. Now, can you say more? Well, when you talk about this, it's a direct human touch, we visit each other's home, we come together. But in the world that people hide behind the screen, hide behind a fake name, hide behind all sorts of digital disguise. And they create such antagonism.
Yeah.
Could you say more about how humanizing and a non-antagonistic language can be introduced and fostered in communities?
Go ahead, Gil.
I'll just say Yeah, thanks, Rob. And Sherita, thank you for bringing that up. This is a situation where we need leadership and we need regulation. I'll just say it, right? Go back to the invention of the automobile. It took a while before we realized a simple intervention like a seatbelt, would save countless lives. And so this wild landscape of social media has gotten ahead of our common sense. And I really think that we need to demand that there be some sort of regulation, that we don't allow this vehicle of communication to be so easily used to hurt and to destroy and to, under the guise of anonymity, to foment division and to accelerate hatred. It is time for us to recognize the power of this tool. And some of the founders of this resource have come to that understanding. The whole process of algorithmic engagement, for instance, on YouTube, it needs to be reevaluated and reassessed. And the industry could come together and in that sense regulate itself with the right leadership. But in the absence of that, in the meantime, we as consumers, we can vote with our feet, we can vote with our eyeballs, and say that we're not going to continue to participate on platforms that are denied, and we can talk to the sponsors of those platforms that are being used to divide and to dehumanize. And I often say, for instance, words like, I hear people say we need to humanize, and I bristle a little because that almost accepts the fact that somehow our humanity has been destroyed, and it hasn't. We were humans from the beginning, and we remain humans, and we will always be humans, no matter what the lie is that is attempted to be imposed upon us. The word inclusion, to me, I often say, well, it is a little bit reflective of the hierarchy, because it suggests that it belongs to someone and they have the privilege of including you in it. And so we use language that is more akin to our indigenous ancestors, which is expanding the circles of engagement, expanding our outreach and our engagement strategies, which takes away a little bit from the hierarchy perception. But we have a runaway technology now, and now there's some conversation about some efforts of regulation, not enough. But those of us as consumers, we really have to be clear about this and make decisions and voice our concerns, I think.
Beautiful.
They can be used for good,
yes.
But we have to be intentional.
I'm sorry I interrupted, Rob. I wanted to say our audience is so active, and we can't just spend too much time on one question, because I want to pass this one to you, Rob. This is really important. So Edward Burrington, he says, do you think many racial healing initiatives overlook the imperative of including and allowing the majority or perceived oppressors to express their feelings?
Really important question. Really important question. I think one of the dangers that I see sometimes in some practices out there is by insisting that people accept a certain social construct. In other words, there are oppressors and there are the oppressed, right? And I remember some years back a retired dentist friend of mine. He was a white man, somewhat conservative, but he'd spent decades in doing pro bono work in Latin America, right? And there was a deconstructing racism workshop going on that an organization had organized, and I invited him to go along there. After the first day, he said, I need to pull out of this, because he said, I'm being compelled to accept a certain worldview and a certain social construct where I am pictured as the oppressor, right? And that's not helpful. It's really not helpful. I think that's the kind of dialogue which doesn't get us anywhere. So I think we have to create these honest, courageous spaces where everyone accepts themselves, whatever background they're from, whatever their situation. All of us have responsibility for change. All of us can make a start in our own lives. And I think when we go from that perspective, we stop sort of creating these areas where it does become, I think, very difficult for certain ones of the population to feel that they are really welcomed in the dialogue. So that's my sense about it. I think it's an important question, certainly for this country, because otherwise we end up talking to ourselves. I remember being in a meeting with social activists somewhere, and I said at one point, it feels like we're an airplane with one wing, flying in an airplane with one wing. How are we going to bring about change if we only have people with one view in the room? That's not true dialogue.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to ping pong back. Dr. Christopher, here's a kind of a question from the audience. This person didn't leave the name. He said, in my experience in storytelling, the storytelling often results in people of color exposing their trauma and the majority persons responding with compassion, but only with a lot of ignorance, which was extremely frustrating. So how did you avoid such a, and because then even if they are suddenly this question left my screen. I'm really sorry, but yeah, just people of color feel frustrated. Okay. I think that there's a connected question which is not from the audience, but often we come up with this when working with the communities. It's re-traumatizing. So when people talk about trauma, talk about their experience, as they talk about it, they relive those trauma. So how do we actually, those courageous and caring space, can we actually using that space to hold people's courage actually?
Thank you for the question. And I really, thank you. I really appreciate the question. And it's all in the design of the experience and the intentionality of it, which is, I know Rob has written a wonderful book that captures the story of Richmond, Trust Builders, I believe. I've written a book called RX Racial Healing, and it captures for folks the design of an experience where the intention is the equal shared humanity of everyone in the circle. And the questions are not questions that focus on trauma, they focus on experiences of our basic motivational needs. Like we might say, the prompt might be, share a story about a time when you needed to be seen or heard, and you were. How did that experience help you, and how did it shape your life? So everyone is answering a question that reveals their own agency, reveals their deep connection, and all of the people are responding to the same prompt, and they're doing it intimately with another person, and their pairing has been pre-planned, pre-designed, and pre-curated so as to optimize the opportunity for more effective connection. A car runs if it's designed properly. This racial healing process has to be designed with intention, knowing all of these potential risks, right? Knowing what the risks are, but we design the process so that we mitigate those risks and we optimize the outcomes. And that's my answer to that question. And as Rob said, it's not deconstructing racism, it's not anti-racism, it's not anti-sexism, it's not it's pro our shared humanity. And we can do that with a great deal of specificity. And that's, you might say, 21st century racial healing.
Yeah, I think maybe that, thank you, Dr. Christopher. Maybe what you said also touch upon another question that posed by Judain Edwards. But I want to follow up with another question coming from Najia Saeed. And he says, well, no, sorry, I'm just scrolling through. So it's Inigo Lopez. And he said, how do you actually might you define more precisely the main methodology to assure the output of the types of meetings and to provoke trust and natural relationship? And someone else I couldn't find from the list because there's lots of questions also say, how, when you actually build a relationship, how do you sustain the relationships?
Now there's the rub,
Well,
right?
that's a rub. I mean, I would say there is no way that you can ensure the outcome of any racial healing circle or dialogue, right? I mean, this is, and I remember a great mentor of mine, Dr. Hugh Doherty, who teaches at the Harvard School of Leadership, Kennedy School, wonderful facilitator. But I remember him saying to some folks that he was training, some facilitators, he said, as a facilitator, you're always going to fail, right? So you may as well accept the fact that you're going to, and I think the vulnerability of the facilitator is really important, right? We're not going into the dialogue thinking that we know the answer. We may come to some answers, but we don't know. And I think we have to be, we have to go into a dialogue really having left our own preferences, prejudices, preconceived ideas. I'm talking about the facilitator now. You've got to leave those things at the door, and really sort of try and sense. I mean, this is why it was important at the beginning, that Gail took time for us to breathe. You have to keep doing that throughout any experience like this as things come up, because things will become difficult, and you have to find a way of working with that. So I think you can read all kinds of, there's lots of good books out there about dialogue, right? That's not the problem. I think there are certain principles that we can apply that Dr. Christopher talked about. But it's always going to be, as I said, a journey of discovery. You can't assume that everything is going to work out exactly as you planned.
Thank you.
I would add, I agree with you, Rob, but I would add to that you want to be prepared by people who've had experience doing this kind of work. You want to be part of a community of facilitators of this work.
Exactly.
Whenever we do the work, we come together and prepare ourselves for doing it. And then most importantly, we debrief afterwards so that we have a chance to unpack and to continue to build our learnings of what happened or didn't happen and how might we have done it differently. You can build into your design all sorts of neuroscience and psychological wisdom to try and mitigate and reduce risk. But ultimately, I agree with Rob, none of us can guarantee anything, but we can do our best to design an affirmative, empathetic, compassionate process that affirms the humanity of every single person in the room. But not everybody should do this work. Right. Again, it takes a special kind of temperament to engage in this work with the humility and the sincerity that's required.
I think Sherto was saying also, I think you said something about the question of sustainability. What was that? Was it
sustaining relationship?
Sustaining the relationship, right? We often use the phrase accompanying people. How do we accompany people in their journey, right? Because how do we build relationships that are, not based on achieving a particular outcome necessarily, or at least how do we support other people in doing their best work? Let me put it that way. How do we support other people in doing their best work? And we're walking alongside those people, to help them do what's deepest in their heart. And it's a rare thing that we're usually so busy, preoccupied with what we're trying to do. But I think the greater gift is if we can really be intentional about walking alongside people and accompanying them on their journey and helping them to be their best selves, helping them to do their best work in whatever it is that they're doing, I think is an important aspect.
I'm going to take I'm going to mix a few more questions together into one. I think you talk about narrative change, relation building, interpersonal contexts, and so on. But you also talk about, Dr. Christopher's beginning, you talk about structural embedding and the transforming systems, economic systems, and possibly political system. And our friend Charles Ogino from Uganda also talk about how you can continue this kind of work within the refugee camp context. And so I'm going to ask you, if there is such a thing, using your structural kind of metaphor, if there is such a thing as healing architecture, we talk about structure, building, and so if we're looking at the healing architecture, what might it look like? So what are the key core pillars that support such a healing architecture? And in your experience, or if you haven't thought about that, can we actually imagine it together on the spot? Thank you.
Wow. Rob, do you want to go first?
No, please go ahead.
Oh, well, that didn't work. Okay. No, if I'm totally candid, the architecture of healing begins with the affirmation and the love of self. As I said in my brief opening remarks, we're either usually projecting our confusion, our fear, our hatred, or we're extending love and compassion. And so the first step, and this applies no matter what the lived experience is, those opportunities for gaining a sense of our own value, our own worth as a human being, and that's usually through relationships. Sometimes it's relationships with family, sometimes it's relationship with significant others, parents, and sometimes it's a deep, deep, deep spiritual relationship with a perception of a connection to, for want of a better word, I'll just say divine intelligence or consciousness or spirit. But somehow we as human beings, the first step in healing is our own healing and our own sense of being affirmed in terms of our value. And the next step is the extension of that. When you're filled with that, you automatically want to share that with others. You want to extend that to those that you meet. And then when that happens, you realize that we want to construct a world in which the opportunity for that is the norm and not the exception. And that is the consciousness as well as the structural or policy change. We call it the ABCs of racial healing, but it is affirmation and appreciation, a sense of belonging and value and worth, the extension of that in those steps. I hope that that's helpful. Rob?
Yes. There's a lot of different aspects to this. I mean, I think we've talked earlier about the whole process of acknowledging the truth of history, of finding some way of maybe where appropriate apologies to be made, forgiveness to be extended. But then I think the third aspect really is accountability. How do we hold ourselves and our communities accountable for change? And that, I think, is important at a personal level, but it's also important, I think, at a community level, that we have to be willing to hold ourselves and our communities accountable and to ensure that decisions made are actually carried forward in meaningful ways.
Thank you. We thank Dr. Christopher, we thank Rob, and we thank this audience for being together. May the narrative of love and humanity continue. Thank you.